Hi everyone, and welcome to our Supports and Accommodations video series presented to you by the Office of Educational Assessment and Accountability at the Michigan Department of Education. This webinar is going to cover supports for students who are English learners. My name is Jen Paul. I am the OEAA's English Learner and Accessibility Assessment Consultant. The topics we're going to cover today are a review of our supports and accommodations framework. We'll go over how to go about selecting appropriate supports for our students who are English learners. And we will be going over, of course, a review of most of our high-use supports and accommodations that students who are English learners would have access to for our state assessments. Big ideas for the framework. If you have not taken a look yet at the supports and accommodations guidance document, you may not yet be familiar with the framework that we utilize to present the information about the supports and accommodations for students. We have some big ideas, which are as follows. We want everyone to make sure that they're making team-based decisions. And this means team-based decisions even for your students who are English learners. You might be wondering, well, who is a part of our team that should be making those decisions? Any of your educators that are working with your students who are English learners should be a part of making those team-based decisions for which supports a student might need to have as a part of the state required assessments. You also need to make sure that you're making individual student decisions. Just because a student is an English learner does not mean that the student is the same as another English learner. One English learner could be a recent arrival that has a very basic knowledge of English proficiency, while another English learner could have been here for a number of years and they have a very intermediate to high English proficiency level. The types of supports that those students need are going to be very different from each other. So just make sure that you're making individual student decisions. And of course, make sure that you are providing supports that a student uses in their regular instruction. What we don't want to have happen is students are using things at the time of the assessment that they really have no knowledge about. They've never used before in the classroom, and it could potentially be much more harmful to the student and their achievement on the assessment if they're given something that they really don't know anything about. So here are our three major categories for the supports and accommodations framework itself. These are the terms that we use across our state assessments. We have what are called universal tools. These are things that are available to all students, and the use is primarily student-driven. So for example, a student may use an embedded highlighter within the online assessment system. They might have access to that throughout the whole assessment. That was not a decision that had to be made whether or not to give the student a highlighter. It's just there and is available. And if the student wants to use it, then they can use it. Designated supports is the second category of supports that you would see in our documentation. This term is for a level of type of tools that are available to all students who have a specific need. And the use is primarily educator-driven. So an example for our English learners might be a student might need access to a bilingual word-to-word dictionary for the time of the assessment. They might want to use it on the math assessment, and they would in fact be able to do that if it was the M-STEP assessment. The decision to use that is based on a student's need. So, and that need is based again primarily on what the educators are doing in the classroom for that student. And then our last category of tools would be those things that are actually called accommodations with a capital A. These are only going to be things and tools that are available to students with disabilities or those who have 504 plans with the need for that tool or support identified in their IEP or 504 plan. For example, a student who may need a Braille assessment, that Braille would be considered an accommodation. The need for Braille would be identified in their IEP or 504 plan potentially. So it's not the case that all students with disabilities have access to everything. No, again, this is something that is driven by what it is that the student needs. And that, again, is going to be defined clearly within those required documents, the IEP or 504 plan. One of the things that the OEAA does is monitor usage of supports and accommodations. We do take a look at whether or not school districts are over-accommodating students, meaning has a district decided to turn on text-to-speech passage, let's say, for all of their students, or perhaps they have assigned stacked Spanish to all of their students, which would be very unlikely. Possible, but very, very unlikely. It is also likely that in many of these cases, like I said, we monitor the usage of our supports and accommodations. It's possible that districts could be placed on our assessment monitoring list. All that means is that we would want to have some conversations with the district about how decisions are being made related to the selection of those supports and accommodations, and potentially put a plan of action into place for future assessment years to help really ensure that students are getting what they need at the time of the assessment. We do have some important resources. So how do you actually enable and get some of these supports and accommodations that students might need to have access to? For MSTEP, there's no application process, so you don't need to apply to use, let's say, stacked Spanish for a student who's an English learner. However, some designated supports and accommodations must actually be turned on in the Insight portal by a test coordinator. Similar processes in place for My Access. For PSAT and SAT, there actually is kind of a request process for the vast majority of accommodations and supports that students might be using. For ACT, there's no request process to utilize those supports and accommodations. And for WIDA, there's also no request type process. But again, similar to My Access and MSTEP, some embedded accommodations must be enabled in the test management system prior to the student actually beginning the assessment. So for the purposes of this video, when a designated support or accommodation must actually be enabled in the online test management system, this icon will be displayed, the plus icon. Let's talk a little bit about our English learner students. We have, as I already mentioned, a variety of students that actually compose the English learner group. You have students that have low English proficiency levels. You have students with an intermediate English proficiency, high English proficiency. You have students who are refugees. Many of our refugees are coming from backgrounds with very limited formal schooling, which has an impact on their day-to-day classroom experiences and the instruction. You have students that are migrants that are here for periods of time, and then they go to another state. We have students who are long-term English learners. So these are students that have not yet reached the proficiency level necessary to be exited from English Learner Services. They may have been here for a number of years and they have not been able to exit from that EL status yet. And then we also have students with disabilities who are actually also English learners. But when you want to make those decisions about what supports a student needs, this is really about knowing your students, which is why it goes back to making sure that you're including the educators that work with these students the most. Some of the questions that you'll want to start asking are things like, what is the student's level of English proficiency? And also, what is their level of proficiency in their native language? These questions can certainly have an impact on the type of support that a student might need at the time of classroom instruction, as well as on the state assessments. We're going to start with M-STEP, and let's talk first about what would be appropriate for a student that has low English proficiency for the M-STEP assessment. We do offer a designated support for a full on-the-fly oral translation. This is going to be available for students who are better able to show what they know by understanding the content of the assessment in another language. This is available for paper, pencil, science, and social studies. However, the translator, whoever's actually going to be orally translating the test for the student, must use the English reader script as their guide. It's also something that's available for the online math assessment as well. In that particular case, you must do an individual administration so that no other students are distracted. The translator in that case must use the read aloud guidelines found in the supports and accommodations guidance document. You can also do a on-the-fly oral translation for paper, pencil, math students as well. However, translating any material, any content for the English Language Arts Assessment for M-STEP is not available. It's not an allowable support for students because the purpose of that assessment is to measure a student's knowledge of language arts in English, not the knowledge of language arts in Spanish or the knowledge of language arts in Arabic or whatever the languages the student might speak or have knowledge of. Again, just kind of giving you a little bit more detail here. Those on-the-fly oral translations are available for paper, pencil, math, as I just mentioned. You can administer that in small groups with students with the same language needs. So for example, if you have a group of students that need Arabic, math, you can group them together and have one translator, as long as those students are in the same grade level, and have one translator translating each test question for the student as they go through the test. Everyone is then able to kind of follow along at the same pace. Again, the translator must use the read aloud guidelines found in the supports and accommodations guidance document. If you're translating into Spanish, educators must use the Spanish read aloud guidelines found in the supports and accommodations guidance document as well. And again, not something that's available for English language arts. One thing that we really want to impress on educators is that you should not be providing an oral translator for students just for the purpose of taking the state assessments. If the student isn't regularly getting a support like that on a regular basis in the classroom, then you really should not be providing it for the purposes of the assessment. Also know that not every educator is qualified to administer the test for a student with an on-the-fly translation. We do have some qualifications that we would like folks to adhere to when they think about who can actually do those on-the-fly translations. And there's a qualifications list that we provide in the supports and accommodations guidance document as well. For example, with some students that are using languages that are very low frequency languages, the only person that you might be able to find that speaks that language is perhaps a parent of that student. That's not going to be an appropriate choice for administration of the assessment. Another option for students that have low English proficiency is a full text stacked Spanish translation option. This is available online and paper pencil for math. It's also available for online social studies. In this case, you can group administer this assessment if those students are taking that assessment in the same grade. If students use this, they are also provided Spanish audio by default. Students also might want to use or need to use Arabic and Spanish DVDs as an option. This is only available for science and social studies. You can administer this individually, of course, but you can also administer this in a small group for students. In this case, students are presented with the English test question on the screen as it appears in their test booklet. The student then hears the question and answer options, and that's what's read aloud to them in Arabic or Spanish. So it is different from the stacked Spanish option available for math and social studies right now, in that this does not provide a written translation for students to view. It's all audio. So here are some options that are good for intermediate to nearly proficient English learners. Students can use a paper-based bilingual word-to-word dictionary option. This is really going to be something that's most helpful for students who are intermediate to nearly proficient students because of the time-consuming nature of their use. Meaning, if you've ever taken a look at one of these word-to-word bilingual dictionaries that are paper-based, you can imagine if a student had very limited English proficiency, the amount of time it would take for that student to look up absolutely every single word in that book just so they could get through one particular test question. If a student has a very intermediate to nearly proficient, and sometimes at times proficient even students might benefit from this, then they only need to reference that word-to-word bilingual dictionary a handful of times during the course of the assessment, and it's much more manageable for them. These dictionaries or glossaries, these bilingual word-to-word dictionaries, don't actually provide definitions. What they do is provide a word-to-word translation without defining the words for students. These resources must be paper-based due to test security concerns. Students can use these resources for math, science, or social studies. And again, providing this for English language arts would invalidate the test. Some other really good options are the paper-based L1 glossary. So that's L1 being first language. These are resources that we provide, MDE provides, and are available for paper pencil mathematics. They're available in approximately 10 languages. They must be accessed through the OEAA secure site. And the words listed on the glossary are specific to the test questions for the paper pencil form. So for example, a student would see the list of questions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. down the left-hand side of the glossary, they would see a selection of words for each question and a corresponding translation. So it's not going to provide all of the words that could be translated within a test question. It's just going to provide a selected set of words within the test question itself. For students that are taking the online assessment, they do have a similar option. Students can use the Arabic or the Spanish glossary, and it works the same way. It's just an electronic version of the resource that matches the test form that they would be taking online. And again, it's going to list the words that correspond to the particular test question. And again, it's just a selected set of words from the test questions themselves, not every single word from the test question. So for some of your students, text-to-speech may be an option that students could benefit from. Again, if your students are English learners, this is just a decision that you're going to have to make at the local level utilizing our text-to-speech and read-aloud guidance that we have in the supports and accommodations guidance document. And I would also direct folks to take a look at the text-to-speech video that will accompany this English learner video as well. The College Board assessments, so we've switched now from M-STEP to the College Board assessments. The College Board assessments do offer some supports for students who are ELs. One of those supports is the availability of 50% extended time and paper-based word-to-word bilingual glossaries. In this case, for College Board's assessments, there is a list of bilingual glossaries from which you must select in order for a student to use that particular support. So it's not the case that a student can use just whatever. There's a list that students should be selecting from. ACT WorkKeys also has some supports and accommodations that are going to be useful for students that might be English learners, such as, again, a bilingual word-to-word glossary option. Again, this is from a specific list of glossaries that you would have to select from. And there is a full-text Spanish version of the ACT WorkKeys assessment. Students in this particular case, if they took that assessment, they would receive the results in Spanish as a Spanish NCRC, which is your National Career Readiness Certificate. There are some students, of course, as I mentioned, that are both students with disabilities as well as being English learners. And for some of those students, they're going to be taking one of the My Access assessments. In those cases, students can use paper-based word-to-word dictionaries. You can have on-the-fly oral translations when appropriate and available for the content area. And of course, if you have students who have very specific needs that are not listed in the supports and accommodations guidance document, you should be sending that email to mde-oeaa@michigan.gov for clarification. Let's talk about the WIDA assessment, which is an assessment specifically designed for all students that are English learners. That's the only type of student that should be taking the WIDA assessments. WIDA has universal tools available and accommodations available. There's no middle category of designated supports. You've just got universal tools and accommodations. And your accommodations are, again, only going to be things that are available for students who have an IEP and 504 plan and whose IEP 504 plan indicates the need for that accommodation. There are no supports on this assessment that are going to be available to support a student's second language needs, to address their English needs. Why? Because the assessment is measuring their ability in the English language. So, for example, you cannot translate this assessment because what we're measuring is students' English abilities. That's exactly what we want. And I often hear people say, well, but how can they take this test? They don't know English. That's okay. It's okay if they don't know English. That doesn't matter for this assessment. That's exactly what we are trying to understand better when students take the WIDA assessments. There is an opportunity for educators to receive what is called a first-year EL exemption for some of their English learner students. This is an exemption from some of the required state assessments. However, there's some caveats around this. In order for a student to be considered for this first year EL exemption, students have to be considered what we call a recent arrival, meaning they've been in U.S. schools 12 months or less. And if they are, then they might be eligible to be exempt from the first year of any of the English language arts portions of the state assessments. So a student could be exempt from the MSTEP ELA test or from the appropriate content areas for the College Board assessments. However, the exemption only applies to English language arts, not English language development and proficiency, which is what the WIDA assessment measures. So it does not apply to WIDA. You can find additional guidance about this particular exemption in the supports and accommodations guidance document. And again, just want to point folks to a lot of really great resources available on our web pages. Of course, one of the most important ones where you can find all of this information that I've covered in the video, which is the supports and accommodations guidance document. There are also supports and accommodations recording and tracking resources to help you stay organized throughout the process of selecting and identifying Universal Tools designated supports and accommodations for students. And if you have any questions after watching today's video, please send them to mde-oeaa@michigan.gov. Thank you so much.